My name is Lucy and I am in the second year of the Counselling MSc at Bangor University, and I'm currently in the process of completing my research project, for which my supervisor is Faye Short. I've been doing my research on the impact of virtual reality safe spaces on anxiety and well-being, and in this presentation I'm going to talk to you about the background of this study, how it was carried out, and what the results have shown so far. Virtual reality has been around since the late 50s and over time has been developed into a more immersive medium reaching a variety of industries. It's largely known for its presence in the entertainment industry. To explain what VR is and how it works, it is an interactive media that aims to create a sense of presence for the user. Immersive VR functions by sensing the user's motions and accordingly adjusting the synthetic environment to create real-time interactions. In addition, it engages the user's senses of sight and hearing to create the illusion of being present in the environment and encourages the user's perception of the experience to disregard the involvement of technology. As well as being popular for entertainment, virtual reality has extensive medical uses, from rehabilitation with stroke patients, to pain reduction via distraction, to exposure therapy with PTSD patients, and attention training for people with ADHD. Virtual reality has also been used to treat anxiety. For instance, there is a wealth of research into exposure therapy for social anxiety disorder, general anxiety disorder, and phobias including public speaking. In addition, there is research using virtual reality to treat anxiety by using its relaxation potential through the control of the simulation properties to create a calmer environment with therapeutic characteristics. For example, the use of sounds such as wave noises, or as used in this study, the crackling noise of a fire. Such noises are similar to those often used in relaxation exercises such as mindfulness. A study by Reaver et al. In 2007 used 3 varying VR environments to explore whether being immersed into the simulations could alter emotional states. They found that the anxious environment reduced positive affect, whereas the relaxing environment increased positive affect and happiness. This research suggests that through the control of audio-visual features such as sound and lighting, VR can elicit emotional states. In addition, researchers also found that a calming narrative paired with the VR experience significantly increased relaxation in comparison to the calming narrative alone. This shows that the VR environment acted as an effective agent and so further supports the use of VR technology as a therapeutic tool. The reason I chose to do this study, and to do it with student populations, was because of the extensive mental health problems displayed in educational environments. Students across a range of ages are thought to experience elevated anxiety due to the lifestyle pressures, financial strains, performance anxiety, and achievement pressures. Research in the UK has found that during university, 20% of students who were previously symptom-free became anxious at a clinically significant level during their time at university. Considering the research showing the effectiveness of virtual reality in reducing anxiety and the high rates of anxiety experienced by students, VR may be an appropriate therapeutic tool to implement in educational settings. Following on from the research just presented, the current study had 3 hypotheses. The first, exposure to the virtual reality safe space environment will reduce anxiety. The second, exposure to the virtual reality safe space environment will increase positive affect. And the third, exposure to the virtual reality safe space environment will decrease negative affect. In order to test the hypotheses in educational settings, we used opportunity sampling to access higher education students recruited through SONA at Bangor University, and through connections provided by Spectrum Mind Technologies, we had a population of high school students from Rill High School. This study had a mixed measures design, meaning that there were both between and within subjects independent variables. The between subjects variable was virtual reality exposure, which had 3 levels: virtual reality safe space, virtual reality blank screen, and no virtual reality. The within subjects variable was time, which had 4 intervals: calm thought, anxious thought, during VR exposure, and post-VR exposure. The dependent variables were the current anxiety level measure, known as the calm, which was our measure of anxiety, and the brief measures of positive and negative affect scale, known as the PANAS, which was our measure of well-being. Both of these questionnaires use Likert scales to score statement-type questions which were read out to the participants and provided quantitative data. During the first interval of this study, calm thought, the researcher read out a narrative to the participant, which included asking them to think of a calm thought and hold this thought whilst we then read out the questionnaire items to them and recorded their answers. This interval was to get a baseline score for all participants in order to show that their anxiety all started at a similar level. The second interval worked the same, but this time the participants were asked to think of an anxious or stressful thought instead of a calm one. This meant they were in control of the extent of the anxious provoking thought and could again hold this thought whilst we worked through the questionnaires with them. This followed the calm thought interval to show that the anxious thought activity was the cause of the increase in anxiety, and that anxiety was in fact elevated before beginning the VR exposure stage. That brings us to the third interval, the during exposure stage, in which participants were randomly allocated to one of the 3 virtual reality exposure conditions, either VR safe space, VR blank screen, or no VR, with the aim of finding a difference between the changes in anxiety and affect levels. These images here are screenshots of the safe space environment created and provided by Spectrum Mind Technologies. Again, whilst in the allocated condition, participants listened to a narrative and answered the questionnaire items. During this stage, there was no instruction of thought, rather participants were left with their own thoughts. The final interval, post-VR exposure, entailed participants once again being asked to think of a calm thought, then working through the questionnaires. This interval was to look for any further decreases in anxiety, but also to calm any participants whose anxiety did not decrease in the VR exposure stage and so may still have been elevated from the anxious thought interval. The study was approved by the Ethics Committee of the School of Psychology at Bangor University. The study procedure entailed ethical necessities such as informed consent, maintaining confidential participant information, safety and well-being considerations, and debriefing. The study was conducted in collaboration with Spectrum Mind Technologies. However, they were not actively involved in the research beyond access to samples and provision of the VR systems, in order to protect the quality of the research. To elaborate, they didn't have any access to any individual participant data and were not present for the completion of testing. In order to analyse the results and produce inferential statistics, all of the data was inputted into SPSS to run 3 separate 2x3 mixed ANOVAs for each population. The first ANOVAs analysed the calm thought and anxious thought interval data with each of the dependent variables in order to answer the question, did the anxious thought exercise cause an increase in anxiety? The second ANOVAs analysed the anxious thought and during VR exposure interval data with each of the dependent variables in order to answer the question, does being in the VR safe space cause anxiety to reduce more than the other VR conditions? The final ANOVAs analysed the during VR exposure and post-VR exposure interval data with each of the dependent variables in order to answer the question, does calmness continue over time following the VR experience? The reason the data was analysed like this was because running one large 3x4 mixed ANOVA looked at too many different variables and relationships at once, and it would have been difficult to read the data as specifically. Also, whilst it could tell us whether over time there was a significant difference in anxiety and affect, it would not tell us what impact the VR had, whereas looking at only 2 time points at a time allowed me to answer these 3 specific questions in order to accurately address the hypotheses. Presented here is the data which answers my first question. Did the anxious thought exercise cause an increase in anxiety? You can see there from the circled values in the first column for time that anxiety, positive affect, and negative affect all significantly changed between the calm thought and anxious thought intervals for both populations. This means that the anxious thought exercise did in fact cause anxiety to significantly increase and affect to be significantly altered. What this also showed us is that, as expected, anxiety started at a similar level for all participants in all three of the conditions across both populations, as there is not a significant difference in anxiety or affect levels between the conditions. That brings us to question 2. Does being in the virtual reality safe space cause anxiety to reduce more than the other VR conditions? We can see here from the time columns that anxiety, positive affect, and negative affect did all significantly change between the anxious thought and during VR exposure intervals. However, as you can see in the second column, there was no main effective condition for any of the measures. Thus, whilst anxiety did change, it may have just been because the participants stopped doing the anxious thought exercise. Nevertheless, there was a main effective interaction for the PANAS positive results circled there in the third column, which I will discuss further later on. This was the most important set of data as it answers the hypotheses. Unfortunately, hypothesis 1, that exposure to the virtual reality safe space environment will reduce anxiety, was not confirmed, nor was hypothesis 3, that the exposure to the virtual reality safe space environment will decrease negative affect. However, hypothesis 2, that the virtual reality safe space environment will increase positive affect, was confirmed from the significant interaction just mentioned. Finally, this is the data for question 3. Does calmness continue over time following the VR experience? There was a significant main effect of time for the higher education population, showing that anxiety, positive affect, and negative affect significantly changed over time between the VR condition and the post-VR activity. However, there was not a significant main effect of time for the secondary school population for positive or negative affect, only anxiety, meaning that affect had no further changes in the post-exposure interval. There was mostly no significant main effective condition, meaning that all of the participants across all three groups reduced at similar rates. For both populations, there was mostly no significant interaction between time and VR condition, meaning that the changes seen over time were not caused by the VR condition. Finally, this is the data for question 3. Does calmness continue over time following the virtual reality experience? There was a significant main effect of time for the higher education population, showing that anxiety, positive affect, and negative affect significantly changed over time between the during exposure and the post-exposure intervals. However, there was not a significant main effect of time for the secondary school population for positive or negative affect, only anxiety, meaning that affect had no further changes in the post-exposure interval. There was mostly no significant main effective condition, meaning that all of the participants across all three groups reduced at similar rates. For both populations, there was mostly no significant interaction between time and VR condition, meaning that the changes seen over time were not caused by the VR condition, but rather by the natural reduction of anxiety after the anxious thought exercise had ended. Going back to the significant main effect of interaction for the PANAS positive results, this graph further demonstrates the difference between the changes in positive affect across the three conditions. As you can see, the increase for the VR safe space condition is a much larger one than the increases seen for the blank screen VR and no VR conditions. This could show that the VR safe space condition increased engagement, happiness, and concentration. Whilst anxiety and negative affect did not decrease, this may show that the VR software can function as a distracting agent in order to alter positive mood states. As I continue to work on this project, this will be looked into further in relation to previous research on VR distraction for anxiety and VR as an effective media. Whilst I may not have found direct therapeutic effects for anxiety, the results do still show that the VR safe space was effective at distracting from anxiety-provoking stimuli by increasing engagement in the presented stimuli. I aim to continue with this project by considering why the VR safe space did not significantly reduce anxiety or negative affect. To begin, I will consider the possibility that anxiety did not continue from the anxious thought interval into the during VR phase, and also that there may have been too many time intervals, meaning the study became repetitive and boredom effects influenced the data. I will also examine the quality of the study, potential implications, and how future research could build on these findings. As I mentioned before, this project is still being completed, so if anyone would like to hear further discussion of the findings later on, then please do contact me. Please also do comment or email me on the address provided if you have any questions about this research. Thank you very much for listening. Please find a reference list on the final 2 slides for the literature referred to throughout the presentation.